She ruled the neighborhood with fines, threats, and cruelty until she cut into my disabled daughter with a zip tie. She never knew every second was being watched by the FBI. The day they came for her, Karen's reign ended in handcuffs, and our street finally breathed free. The neighborhood looked ordinary to any outsider driving through its freshly painted gates, manicured lawns, and neatly pruned shrubs. But underneath the perfection and forced smiles, there were battles waged daily between control and freedom, power and resistance. At the heart of it all was a woman everyone had come to know simply as Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of the Homeowners Association. She walked the sidewalks with a clipboard in hand and a permanent scowl etched across her face, policing the smallest details. Whether it was a mailbox half an inch too tall, a garden hose not coiled properly, or a child's toy left out on the grass. To her, rules were weapons, and neighbors were merely offenders waiting to be caught. For our family, Karen's obsession with control had always felt suffocating, but things escalated when she set her eyes on my daughter. My daughter, though fragile and disabled, carried a joy that made people smile. She loved flowers, wind chimes, and coloring the world with innocence that no hardship could erase. But to Karen, my daughter was a problem, too slow on the sidewalks, too loud when she laughed, too different from the image of perfection she demanded for the community. And so, the harassment began. It started small, with notes slipped into our mailbox warning us about violations that never existed. Then came the verbal remarks about eyesores whenever my daughter's wheelchair ramp was visible from the street. Soon, it escalated to calls to the HOA board, demanding fines for supposed infractions. Every time, Karen stood behind her curtain, watching, waiting, as if my family's suffering was entertainment for her lonely evenings. But that day, the day she crossed an irreversible line, began like any other. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle, and my daughter was outside in the garden, humming to herself as she admired the roses that lined the walkway. She reached out to touch one, her fingers brushing against the petals, her face glowing with the kind of happiness only a child could feel. That was when Karen appeared, her footsteps sharp against the concrete, her shadow stretching like a warning across the yard. Karen had always carried small objects with her, a tape measure, a notepad, and, oddly enough, zip ties. She claimed they were for securing loose wires or keeping garbage bins from falling open, but they had become symbols of her authority, as if she could bind anything she disapproved of into submission. My daughter, unaware of the danger, looked up at her, her small hand still clutching the rose. In that instant, Karen's anger boiled over. She saw the flower not as a harmless treasure in a child's hand, but as a stolen possession, a violation of neighborhood order, a crime against her rigid world. What she did next was something no one could have imagined. With chilling precision, she pulled one of those zip ties from her pocket and lashed it against my daughter's arm, dragging it across her skin with a coldness that froze time itself. The plastic bit into her delicate flesh, leaving behind a line of raw, burning pain. My daughter cried out, the sound piercing the serene afternoon and shattering it into fragments of horror. Neighbors heard but pretended not to. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, but no one stepped forward. Fear of Karen had silenced them for years, and their silence now became her shield. She walked away with that same scowl on her face, muttering under her breath, while my daughter sobbed in her chair, clutching the wound she could not understand. To Karen, it was a punishment for daring to pick a flower. To my daughter, it was a scar that would last far longer than the sting of plastic. But what Karen didn't know, what none of the neighbors knew, was that this neighborhood had been under quiet observation for weeks. Complaints had been stacking up, not just from us, but from families across the community who had suffered at Karen's hands. The harassment, the intimidation, the calculated cruelty, it had all reached the attention of authorities who were no longer willing to ignore it. The FBI had already set up discreet surveillance in the area, responding to a broader investigation into abuse of power, harassment, and even financial fraud within the HOA. Every street corner, every mailbox, every gate camera had quietly become an eye for justice, and when Karen slashed my daughter's skin with that zip tie, The cameras captured every second. Still, in that moment, all I felt was rage and helplessness. I scooped my daughter into my arms, holding her trembling frame as tears stained her cheeks. The wound wasn't deep enough to threaten her life, but it was deep enough to etch trauma into her memory. No parent should ever have to witness such cruelty. No child should ever suffer for simply being themselves. As I carried her inside, I knew something had changed. This wasn't another petty note, another fine, another insult. This was assault. This was an attack. And this was going to end. That night, as I tended to my daughter's injury, I couldn't shake the thought that Karen had gone too far even for her. But little did I know, her arrogance and cruelty had already sealed her fate. The cameras hidden in plain sight, installed under the cover of routine maintenance, had caught the slash, the expression on her face, the lack of remorse in her walk. The evidence was undeniable, and soon the truth would surface in ways Karen could never control. Yet for us, all that mattered in that moment was healing my daughter. The wound on her arm was a mark of Karen's hatred, but it was also the start of something bigger, a story that would unravel her reign of fear and expose the darkness she had built around this community. As I looked out the window into the quiet street, I noticed the faint glimmer of a red light on a nearby lamppost, a camera, watching, recording. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope rising through the despair. Justice was not only possible, it was already in motion. And while Karen believed she had silenced us once again, she had unknowingly handed the FBI the very proof they had been waiting for. The tide was turning. The next morning, the neighborhood looked as pristine as always. Lawns were watered, sprinklers rotated with perfect rhythm, and the air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. It would have seemed like any other peaceful suburban day, but for my family, the peace was gone. My daughter remained quiet, her arm wrapped in gauze, her usual laughter muted by the memory of Karen's cruelty. She sat in her wheelchair near the window, staring out at the garden she once loved, her eyes following the roses, but never daring to reach for them again. The wound on her skin was healing, but the wound inside her heart had only begun to grow. What Karen did not know was that her actions had already set a series of events into motion, events far bigger than herself, bigger even than the HOA she had so carefully manipulated for years. The FBI, whose presence in the neighborhood had gone unnoticed, had not only captured the attack on camera, but also logged every step Karen had taken afterward. From the moment she lashed out with that zip tie to the moment she casually tossed the broken tie into a trash bin, everything was recorded. But the FBI wasn't only watching Karen. They had been quietly observing the entire HOA board for months, investigating reports of harassment, misuse of funds, and organized intimidation of residents. Families who had once lived in silence, too afraid to speak out, had unknowingly become pieces of a puzzle the FBI was putting together. My daughter's injury was the final piece they needed, the act that transformed Karen from a nuisance into a criminal suspect, and the HOA from a neighborhood committee into a target of federal scrutiny. For years, the board had hidden behind rules and regulations, bending bylaws to favor certain residents while punishing others who dared to resist. They imposed outrageous fines for trivial matters, forced homeowners to repaint houses unnecessarily, and collected fees that never seemed to make their way into community improvements. Karen, though not officially a board member, had become their enforcer, their eyes and ears, their weapon of fear. She thrived on the power, and the board thrived on her intimidation. It was a perfect storm of control, but storms always leave evidence in their wake. The FBI knew Karen was more than just a petty bully. She was the thread that connected dozens of reports, dozens of victims, all tied to the same HOA board. Every outburst, every note, every act of harassment she carried out became another log on the fire building beneath her. Neighbors who had once whispered their complaints now found their words written into official files, sealed in evidence folders that carried the weight of truth. And every camera hidden in lampposts, mailboxes, and community gates provided the images to back those words. Inside our home, we still had no idea just how closely the authorities were watching. All we felt was exhaustion and fear, yet beneath it all, a faint sense of anticipation grew stronger. I couldn't forget the red light I had seen on the lamppost the night before. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just routine maintenance. Someone was watching, and for once, it wasn't Karen. Meanwhile, Karen moved about the neighborhood with her usual arrogance, oblivious to the noose tightening around her. She carried her clipboard like a badge of authority, pointing out weeds in one yard, a chipped fence post in another, scribbling her observations as if she were a police officer keeping order in a lawless land. The neighbors nodded politely when she passed, but behind closed doors, they whispered. Some whispered of her cruelty toward my daughter, others of fines that had left them financially broken, and still others of threats they had received when they dared question the HOA's decisions. Yet they never confronted her, never challenged her. Fear was still her strongest weapon, and silence was still her shield. But silence was not enough anymore. The FBI had begun reaching out quietly to select residents, collecting sworn statements behind the HOA's back. Every account painted the same picture. Karen as the face of harassment, the HOA as the machine of corruption, and families left powerless under their control. The FBI's case was no longer just about financial fraud, it was about intimidation, abuse, and violence. For us, the days that followed were heavy with unease. My daughter refused to go into the garden, refusing even to roll her wheelchair past the front door. She feared seeing Karen again, feared the sting of plastic, feared the look in that woman's eyes. I stayed by her side, but inside my anger burned. I wanted to confront Karen, to demand justice myself, but something held me back. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the faint awareness that justice was already moving forward, guided by hands stronger than mine. Karen's downfall, however, was not going to come quietly. The FBI knew she would not stop. They knew she thrived on escalation, and they needed more. And so, they waited, cameras ready, agents positioned, every angle covered. They didn't just want her cruelty recorded, they wanted her arrogance, her confidence, her unfiltered belief that she was untouchable. They needed the evidence that would silence not just her, but the entire board she served. And Karen gave them exactly what they wanted. Only a few days after the attack on my daughter, she returned to our property. This time, she claimed the ramp leading to our front door was a violation, an eyesore, a structure that damaged the neighborhood's image. Standing there with her clipboard, pointing at the ramp that was my daughter's lifeline, she didn't just threaten fines, she threatened removal. For Karen, it was another act of dominance. For the FBI, it was another recorded confession of discrimination, another nail in the coffin of her reign. That evening, as I tucked my daughter into bed, I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. She was afraid to laugh, afraid to smile, afraid to be the child she once was. Karen had stolen that light from her. But she didn't know she had also given us something in return: evidence, proof, leverage. The cameras didn't lie, and the walls Karen had built to shield herself were beginning to crack. The neighborhood wasn't as silent as it seemed. It was watching, recording, remembering. And soon, the silence would break in the loudest way possible. The neighborhood had always been Karen's stage. Every walkway, every garden, every parked car was another prop she used to reinforce her sense of superiority. For years, she had moved through the streets with the sharpness of someone who believed she was untouchable. But in the days following the incident with my daughter, that confidence began to show its first fractures. They were subtle at first, almost invisible to the casual eye, yet undeniable to those who had suffered beneath her reign. Karen had expected silence, as always. She thought the neighbors would glance away, lower their heads, and carry on with their day. That had always been the rhythm. She barked, they obeyed. Yet now, whispers grew louder. Curtains closed faster when she walked by, and conversations hushed as her footsteps approached. People no longer looked at her with forced admiration or nervous smiles. Instead, they looked past her, over her shoulder, toward the places they knew she could not see: the hidden cameras, the eyes of authority that lingered just beyond the edges of her awareness. What Karen did not yet realize was that her own neighbors had begun to shift. Fear had been replaced by fatigue, and fatigue by quiet courage. The FBI's discreet conversations had given them the first taste of hope, and hope was contagious. Homeowners who once trembled at Karen's clipboard now began to document their own encounters with her. They saved letters she had stuffed in mailboxes, took pictures of the petty fines taped to their doors, and wrote detailed accounts of her threats. They shared them in secret, whispering in garages or behind closed blinds, unknowingly weaving themselves into the larger case already unfolding. Karen sensed the change, though she couldn't quite place it. She walked the streets with the same swagger, but her eyes flickered more often, darting toward windows and shadows. The air didn't feel as submissive anymore. The silence she once commanded now felt heavy, watchful, and suffocating. She tried to dismiss the unease, telling herself it was nothing more than paranoia. Yet paranoia, once planted, is a seed that grows without mercy. The FBI fed that paranoia carefully. Every recorded outburst, every discriminatory remark, every aggressive gesture was cataloged. When Karen scolded a neighbor for leaving their trash can out for 5 extra minutes, it was captured. When she threatened a family with fines for hanging children's drawings in a front window, it was captured. And when she returned to our house and scribbled a notice threatening to remove the ramp, that too was captured, crystal clear in both sound and vision. Karen believed she was protecting her neighborhood's image, but the truth was that she was dismantling her own. Each act, each threat, each sneer was another stone pulled from the foundation of the authority she thought she held. The FBI didn't need to push her. They only needed to let her unravel herself, one outburst at a time. Inside our home, the weight of her actions still lingered. My daughter remained withdrawn, her small hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket, her voice soft when she spoke at all. The ramp that had been a symbol of independence for her was now a symbol of threat, marked by Karen's hatred. Yet even in her silence, she sensed something I hadn't said aloud. Karen's power was slipping. Children often feel shifts adults overlook, and she watched the neighborhood with cautious curiosity, noticing how fewer people avoided our street, how more eyes lingered when Karen passed, how the air itself seemed to change. For Karen, losing control was unthinkable. And so she escalated. She began patrolling the neighborhood at odd hours, circling streets late at night, carrying her flashlight like a weapon against imagined offenders. She prowled with more intensity, convinced someone was testing her authority. In her mind, the neighborhood was slipping into chaos, and only she could restore order. What she didn't realize was that her paranoia was now being logged as instability, her obsession noted as evidence of harassment. The FBI no longer needed to prove she was dangerous, she was proving it herself. Neighbors noticed too. They saw her car idle for long stretches near homes she had fined. They saw her scribbling furiously in her notepad, glaring at houses that had once cowered at her presence, but now seemed indifferent. And they whispered louder. The fear was breaking, replaced by something stronger, anticipation. People began to suspect what Karen could not, that her downfall was no longer just possible, it was inevitable. Still, Karen pressed on, clinging to her fading influence with every ounce of venom she had left. She left notes on doors at dawn, scolded children for chalk drawings on the sidewalk, and threatened an elderly neighbor with fines for excessive bird feeders. To her, each act was a demonstration of control. To everyone else, it was evidence, evidence that mounted with every passing day, evidence that made her look less like an enforcer and more like a tyrant collapsing under her own obsession. Then came the moment that sealed her fate even further. At a neighborhood gathering meant to discuss seasonal landscaping, Karen stood before a small group of residents and launched into a tirade. She spoke of disorder, of disrespect, of how certain families were dragging the neighborhood down. Her words carried the same sharpness they always had. But this time, the audience did not respond with nods. They responded with silence, a silence thick with defiance, a silence recorded by the tiny microphone tucked into the podium. Karen left the meeting unsettled, her clipboard clutched tighter than ever. She had always believed silence meant obedience, but this silence was different. It wasn't submission, it was resistance. And though she could not see it, the walls were closing in around her, brick by brick, record by record. That night, I sat by the window, watching the quiet streets. I thought of how fragile power really was, how quickly the illusion of control could shatter once people stopped believing in it. Karen had ruled through fear, but fear is only as strong as its silence. The silence had broken, even if she hadn't noticed it yet. In the shadows, the cameras still glowed, faintly, watching her every move. The neighborhood was no longer just her stage, it was her trap, and she was performing the final act of her own downfall. By the time summer deepened and the nights carried the weight of heat, Karen's descent had become undeniable. She had always thrived on control, but now her grip was slipping and the cracks in her mask spread into full fractures. What had once been the smug composure of an HOA enforcer transformed into restless pacing, erratic movements, and venomous bursts of rage that echoed through the cul-de-sacs. She could feel it. The neighborhood was no longer hers. And when Karen felt cornered, she didn't retreat. She lashed out. It began with small acts of sabotage. Flower pots overturned in the dead of night, trash cans tipped and scattered across driveways, petty vandalism carefully targeted at families she despised most. She thought herself clever, sneaking in shadows, but the neighborhood had long since learned to look closer. Cameras hidden in gutters, doorbell lenses disguised in porch lights, motion sensors tucked in gardens, all captured her frenzied prowling. Every toppled pot, every midnight trespass, every muttered curse became more damning evidence stacked against her. But evidence wasn't enough for her anymore. Karen wanted fear back. She wanted obedience. And in her desperation, she chose the cruelest reminder of her supposed authority, my daughter. One afternoon, while the sun blazed down and cicadas hummed in relentless rhythm, Karen approached our home again. She carried no clipboard this time, only a coiled length of plastic zip ties, hidden but not enough. She moved with that purposeful stride she had used countless times before, the stride of someone about to mark her territory. But this time, her obsession drove her to something darker than notices or fines. She crouched by the ramp, pulling a tie taut in her hands, muttering about rules and order. Then she turned toward the small figure resting in her wheelchair at the bottom of the slope. My daughter had been enjoying the afternoon light, her fragile hands resting on her lap, her body finally starting to recover from the trauma Karen had already inflicted. And in that fragile stillness, Karen struck again, leaning down with the plastic tie, digging it into her skin with a sharp, brutal twist. The scream tore through the air like shattering glass, a sound that no parent should ever have to hear. It was short, sharp, and filled with both pain and terror. And in that scream, the neighborhood turned its eyes. Windows flew open, blinds shifted, and neighbors stepped onto porches in disbelief. For the first time, Karen's cruelty was no longer hidden in the small shadows of power. It was out in the open, undeniable, irreversible. But Karen wasn't done. Her face twisted with rage, she barked threats into the air, claiming the child was breaking rules by sitting outside, claiming the ramp was an eyesore, claiming that she had the right, always the right, to enforce her vision of perfection. She thought her tirade would once again scatter the neighbors into silence. Instead, it drew them closer. Phones lifted, cameras clicked, voices whispered, the documentation multiplied. And unknown to Karen, it wasn't just phones capturing the assault. The FBI's cameras, the ones carefully hidden in the eaves of homes, the ones positioned to monitor her every move, recorded everything. The scrape of plastic against tender skin, the venom in her voice, the manic gleam in her eyes. For investigators, it was the moment they had been waiting for, irrefutable, undeniable proof of both cruelty and intent. I rushed to my daughter's side, lifting her into my arms as she trembled. The plastic tie, cut away, left a raw welt across her skin, a mark that would take time to heal. But more than the wound, it was the violation that carved itself into memory, the reminder that Karen's obsession wasn't just about lawns and fences. It was about control, domination, and cruelty. Karen however, walked away unshaken, convinced she had reminded everyone of her dominance. She smirked as she returned to her house, believing the neighbor's silence was still hers to command. She didn't notice the whispers had changed. She didn't notice the phones calling not to friends, but to authorities. She didn't notice that fear had turned to fury and fury to action. The FBI, monitoring in real time, moved with urgency. The decision was made not to wait any longer. Karen's escalation meant risk, not just to us, but to anyone in the neighborhood. Her power-hungry spiral had crossed into outright violence, and the line between HOA harassment and criminal assault had vanished completely. She was no longer just a tyrant, she was a danger. That night, Karen continued her rounds, pacing the sidewalks, her flashlight beam darting across lawns like a hunter searching for prey. She muttered to herself about disorder, about families she would fine into compliance, about children she would keep indoors where they belonged. But this time, she was not alone in the darkness. This time, her every step was tracked by more than cameras. Unmarked cars rolled slowly into the neighborhood, parking at discreet angles. Agents blended into shadows, their earpieces glinting faintly in the glow of porch lights. The trap that had been months in the making was tightening. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching the quiet invasion unfold, not fully understanding but sensing that something monumental was about to happen. And Karen, blinded by her obsession, had no idea she was walking into her final act. By dawn, the neighborhood held its breath. The air was charged, heavy with anticipation, as though the streets themselves knew a reckoning was coming. The ramp still bore the marks of Karen's cruelty, my daughter still whimpered in restless sleep, and the neighbors whispered like witnesses waiting for a verdict. Karen believed she was preparing for another day of order. What she didn't know was that the FBI was preparing too, not to observe, not to record, but to strike. The stage was set, and all that remained was for the curtain to fall. The morning began deceptively calm. The sky glowed with soft streaks of pink and gold. Children stirred in their homes, sprinklers ticked rhythmically across lawns, and yet the neighborhood carried an unshakable tension. Behind trimmed hedges, curtains were drawn just enough for watchful eyes to peek through. Everyone felt it, the sense that an ending was near. The streets were no longer Karen's stage. They were the ground on which her empire of control was about to collapse. The FBI had spent weeks preparing, months gathering evidence, and years studying people like her. Karen was no anomaly to them. She was the culmination of unchecked obsession and small-scale power turned toxic. But what set her apart, what elevated her from a nuisance to a priority, was the cruelty she inflicted on the vulnerable. The cameras hidden in porches and eaves had captured everything. Her stalking walks through the night, her vandalism of neighbors' property, and worst of all, the moment she drove a zip tie into the tender skin of my disabled daughter. For investigators, it was no longer surveillance. It was intervention. Karen began her day with her usual routine, striding across her driveway with a clipboard clutched tightly in her hand, her lips pressed into a thin line of disdain. She muttered aloud, ranting about weeds, misplaced trash cans, unapproved lawn ornaments, the trivial grievances she wielded like weapons. But as she marched toward another neighbor's property, a subtle shift stopped her in her tracks. A black SUV rolled slowly into the cul-de-sac, followed by another, then another. They parked with precision, forming a quiet barricade at both ends of the street. Neighbors emerged onto porches clutching phones, holding their breath, whispering in disbelief. The street had become a stage once again, but this time the audience wasn't Karen's to command. From the SUVs, figures stepped out, men and women dressed in dark tactical gear, badges gleaming on their chests, earpieces in their ears. Their presence was unmistakable, their authority undeniable. The FBI had arrived not as silent watchers, but as enforcers. The calm voice of a lead agent rang out, clear and firm, instructing Karen to remain where she was. For the first time in years, someone else was speaking with authority on this street, and it wasn't her. Karen froze, her eyes narrowing. At first, she laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that cracked in the heavy air. She accused the agents of trespassing, claimed they had no right, insisted she was the true authority of the neighborhood. Her voice climbed higher, desperate, trembling with the edges of hysteria. She clutched her clipboard as though it were a shield, the flimsy symbol of her reign, and waved it like a weapon. But the agents were unmoved. They advanced steadily, their formation precise, their eyes fixed on her. Behind them, neighbors captured every second on their phones, knowing history was unfolding in front of their lawns. The woman who had ruled their lives through fear, fines, and cruelty now faced a power she could not bully, a system she could not manipulate. Karen's bravado crumbled quickly. She stepped backward, her voice faltering, then breaking into shrieks. She shouted about conspiracies, about neighbors plotting against her, about being framed. She pointed at houses, screamed names, hurled insults, and finally, in a last wild act of defiance, hurled her clipboard into the street. The papers scattered in the breeze, meaningless fragments of her imagined authority fluttering across the pavement. The agents closed in. One moved forward, cuffs ready, while another read aloud the charges: harassment, vandalism, assault, and multiple counts of endangering a disabled child. The words echoed across the cul-de-sac like a litany of justice, each charge a nail in the coffin of her dominion. Karen thrashed as they restrained her, kicking, clawing, spitting venomous curses. She demanded her rights as HOA president, insisted she was above the law, claimed the FBI was overstepping. But the agents, calm and deliberate, tightened the cuffs around her wrists and led her toward the waiting SUV. For once, Karen's voice held no sway. Her fury met with nothing but steady silence. And in that silence, the neighborhood erupted, not in chaos, but in release. Neighbors clapped, cheered, some wept openly. Parents held their children closer, relief flooding their faces. Phones streamed live, capturing the sight of Karen being escorted away, her reign of fear ending not with triumph, but with humiliation. Inside my home, I held my daughter, her fragile body still recovering from the latest wound Karen had inflicted. She didn't fully understand the scene unfolding outside, but she felt the shift, the tension easing, the whispers fading, the air lightening. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt safe again. As Karen was placed into the back of the SUV, her eyes scanned the crowd one last time. They were wild, darting, desperate, searching for even a shred of loyalty. But there was none. Every neighbor she had threatened, every family she had fined, every child she had tormented stared back at her with cold, unflinching resolve. She had built her empire on intimidation, but it crumbled the moment fear gave way to unity. The SUV door slammed shut, and with that sound, the street transformed. The monster who had stalked sidewalks and weaponized rules was gone. In her place remained scars, the scars of what she had done to us, to my daughter, to the community. But scars heal, and in their healing they grow stronger. The FBI lingered only briefly, taking statements, collecting final evidence, ensuring that the community understood the process moving forward. But the most powerful message needed no words. The sight of Karen, once untouchable, driven away in handcuffs. In the days that followed, the neighborhood blossomed in ways we had almost forgotten. Children played freely on sidewalks again. Parents gathered in driveways without fear of citation. Laughter, once hushed, rang out in the evenings. The ramp that Karen had despised became a symbol, adorned with flowers, ribbons, and cards from neighbors expressing solidarity. What she had tried to use as a mark of shame became instead a monument of resilience. And for me, holding my daughter's hand as she wheeled down that ramp, there was peace. We bore the marks of Karen's cruelty, yes, but we also bore the strength of having endured and triumphed. We had faced down her obsession, her violence, her tyranny, and with the help of watchful eyes and unseen protectors, we had prevailed. Karen had believed she ruled the neighborhood, but in truth, it was the community that ruled itself, bound not by fear, but by unity. And when the moment came, it was not her clipboard or her fines that decided the outcome. It was the weight of justice, carried in the hands of those who refused to look away. Her empire ended in a cul-de-sac under the watchful eyes of the very people she had sought to control. And from that day on, the neighborhood was no longer hers. It was ours again,